What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review of Neverwinter Nights 2. Now, while I usually review games after 100%, occasionally there are games that you simply can't find on Steam, and as my Steam profile is public and what I use to point people in the direction of the proof that I 100% something, I'll just label them as regular reviews, which brings me to my first point for Neverwinter Nights 2, and that is that these days it's really only available on GOG. It used to be available on Steam, however it was pulled off some time ago. These days, again, GOG is pretty much your only option, but the good news there is that the GOG version is a really good version of the game. It comes with all 4 of the main campaigns, and a lot of the problems that plagued the base game's release all the way back in 2006 have largely been taken care of. You can play through it relatively smoothly. I only really ran into one major problem, and otherwise it was a good experience. Now, it's worth mentioning that the second game here was developed by Obsidian, actually, and the original Neverwinter Nights was developed by BioWare. But with that stuff out of the way, I wanted to mention that this review is going to be a little different than a lot of my regular reviews, and that is because the structure of Neverwinter Nights 2 doesn't exactly fit into the way I typically format my reviews. And this is because both Neverwinter Nights 1 and Neverwinter Nights 2 were as much a platform for community content as they were games. However, with Neverwinter Nights 2 in particular, it never saw the widespread adoption that the original did. Now, like a lot of things, there's no one set reason for this, but most people would tell you this is because, again, the launch of Neverwinter Nights 2 was actually pretty buggy. And the second thing I've heard is that the tool set for making content with Neverwinter Nights 2 was more complicated than the original games, which I'm sure, combined with the fact that people had already made a lot of the stuff they wanted to make in the original game, kept them from starting fresh on a separate title. Because if you're unaware, the multiplayer aspect of Neverwinter Nights in general comes down to 2 things: persistent worlds, which are kind of like self-contained MMOs, and the modules. Modules are akin to mods, really. They are typically player-created adventures that you can download, install, and just play through like you would the normal game. Which brings me to my next point about Neverwinter 1's Enhanced Edition. The original Neverwinter has received an Enhanced Edition that actually updated the multiplayer functionality and brought a lot of that back to the game, whereas Neverwinter Nights 2, that is no longer functional. You can click on the multiplayer, but it won't do anything unless you install some mods to restore that functionality. And even then, you kind of need to know where you're going. And because of this, in terms of the persistent worlds, there's really only a handful or so left for Neverwinter Nights 2. However, the modules, there is actually a ton of content. There's roughly 100 or so that are considered very good that you can go download and install. And again, it's not much different than just installing a regular mod. So if you want to get some more content out of Neverwinter Nights 2, that's really the way to do it. But again, there just isn't as much here as there is for the original Neverwinter. And because of all those reasons, we're going to talk about my thoughts on the main 4 campaigns and the systems itself. And speaking of systems, let's dive into that a little bit. Now, Neverwinter Nights 2 was actually based on D&D 3.5, whereas the original Neverwinter Nights was based on 3rd edition. There are some significant changes between 3rd and 3.5. 3.5 is actually a personal favorite of mine, so needless to say, this is a game system that I took to very naturally, and it's the edition of D&D that I probably know the most about. Furthermore, I actually cover Pathfinder a lot. And both of the Pathfinder games still use Pathfinder 1e, which is based on D&D 3.5, which means if you happen to watch all of my Pathfinder content or play the Pathfinder games, Kingmaker or Wrath of the Righteous, you'll likely feel right at home playing this game because the system is more or less the same, albeit with some differences, of course, but very, very similar. However, it is worth mentioning that Neverwinter Nights 2 is real-time with pause, which I'm sure you've seen on screen up to this point, which was honestly pretty common, though in this particular case, I think they kind of toned down some of the difficulty of things that would normally be here, because while I do know the system very well, it was relatively easy to stack a really high AC and just bonuses and buffs in general to then be able to just demolish enemies, which is kind of helped along by the fact that the rest mechanic in the game in all of its variations is much more relaxed than resting in the tabletop version. Now, the exact method of the rest mechanic changes from module to module, but in the base game specifically, it's literally just a 5-second thing you can do out of combat, and there's no real restriction on it, and it completely refreshes your spells, your buffs, your health, all that jazz. Which I tell you so that you know this is a very easy way to play D&D 3.5, as a lot of it is very streamlined. Which brings me to character creation, actually. Character creation in Neverwinter Nights 2 is actually really cool. And this is because we have a ton of options. In fact, I would say the Pathfinder games are really the only comparison in the amount of options you get here. You get a ton of classes, a ton of races, all that stuff to choose from. You can pick backgrounds, all of which is really going to help you build a character. Now, a lot of these options were added by the later modules, but if you're playing it these days, you're likely dealing with all of them. But it's very cool to actually see things like Genasi and the Yuan-Ti actually represented in a video game here, because this is one of the only games that does that. And of course, we have the more standard stuff like humans, elves, dwarves, that type of thing. But let's assume you don't actually know anything about what I'm talking about here, and this is all kind of overwhelming for you. Well, that's where the packages come in. This is a holdover from Neverwinter Nights, actually, where basically at character creation, you can pick a class that sounds cool, and then you can click a sort of package, which is like an auto level up system that lets the game level up your character for you based on a set of predetermined feats and options. And in this way, you can level up pretty effectively without actually knowing what you're doing. And overall, I think it's a good choice to help people who are, in general, a bit unfamiliar with D&D 3.5. Another thing worth mentioning when it comes to character creation, really, is that when you start a new game, you can actually also start with pre-created characters. The game actually comes with a bunch of them as well, but you can actually export your own characters at any time as well, and they'll be whatever level you exported them at, meaning that you can start new campaigns with like a max level character as well, if you really wanted to, which makes the game even easier than before, which I tell you because, again, I really wouldn't let this game be intimidating challenge-wise, because it's as hard as you feel like making it, really. Now, those are probably the core things to know that are applicable to basically every module and campaign. However, each module and campaign can have individual systems that change, again, just based on what you're actually playing. For instance, the rest system in the main campaign is very forgiving, but then in, say, Mask of the Betrayer, one of the expansions, that is limited a little bit by both actual passing of time, which then affects a resource that you need to keep high, basically. So it kind of limits the rest a little bit. But from here, let's actually talk about the campaigns themselves. There are 4, of course, and naturally the main campaign is the biggest one. All of the others are much smaller in scope, but Storms of Zehir in particular is actually still pretty big. And then Mask of the Betrayer and Mysteries of Westgate are smaller in scope. First, let's start with the main campaign. I mostly enjoyed the main campaign, though it does have quite a few faults. For starters, I love the introduction to this particular campaign because you start out as the foster son of someone living in a village called West Harbor. And the tutorial sees you taking part in a festival day of sorts that then teaches you the basics of the game. Spellcasting, attacks, ranged attacks, all that jazz. Again, if you know D&D 3.5, it's not going to be really teaching you anything, but the way they introduce the characters and the general dynamics of the village I thought was really well done. And they do a good job at integrating you into the idea of this village to then, of course, inevitably have it attacked to actually kick the game off. Which sees our foster father sending us to retrieve something that's been hidden in ruins nearby for a long time that he believes the village was attacked for, and then he sends you off to Neverwinter, and so begins your hero's journey. Because the story of the main campaign is incredibly standard hero's journey. It's well done, but it's probably not going to blow you away. And that's because while it does have a lot of cool ideas, it in a lot of ways fails to stick the landing on many of them. For instance, late in the first act of the game, you're sent to clear out an orc camp. However, after you do so, it turns out you had the wrong orc camp, and the game sends you to a second camp. So you have 2 back-to-back significant dungeons with the exact same enemy, which is flimsy at best. And that's just one example of something that tends to recur throughout the title. Now, it does kind of clear up a little later, and then Act 2 and Act 3 are a bit more focused. And in Act 2, there's actually even a really cool trial quest where you can call witnesses, collect evidence, all that stuff to defend yourself in this trial. And the idea was really cool. But, and spoilers for this part, it's timestamped if you want to skip past it, but that trial ends the same way no matter what you do. You get a little bit of an extra reward if you actually win the trial, but that's it. It doesn't affect anything otherwise. So you can completely skip all of the tedious stuff and still get effectively the same end to that trial. And unfortunately, the main campaign is just full of stuff like that, where it's like a cool idea that they just failed to execute. I will say the main campaign does have some fantastic companions and characters. The companions in particular are the real standout. Very Obsidian writing here. Some of the best companion writing I've ever actually seen, in a few cases at least. For instance, the first ones you meet, Kelgar the dwarf, Nishka the tiefling, Alani the druid that you meet. Again, all very, very well-written characters that then, unfortunately, the ending of the main campaign just tosses right out the window. Because while there are plenty of things about the main campaign that I genuinely enjoy, the ending to the main campaign is just bad. Thankfully, the expansion Mask of the Betrayer kind of salvages it a little bit, and honestly feels like a proper send-off to the story arc, but literally right up until the end of the game, I was like, why do people not like the main campaign so much? And then after you defeat the last boss and the ending happens, I was like, wow, that is really disappointing. It has an incredibly unsatisfying conclusion. But in spite of all those things, overall, I do think the main campaign is really cool. Some really great characters there. There's a little bit of choice and consequence here and there, even if it all ends largely the same way. But that brings us to Mask of the Betrayer. There are very few expansions out there, if you will, that get as much praise as Mask of the Betrayer, and I can honestly say that most of it is well deserved. I certainly don't think it's perfect by any means, but Mask of the Betrayer is very well done. For starters, it's a much shorter experience than the main campaign. It's like maybe 8 to 10 hours, kind of depending on how you play, but it's pretty short. However, what was kind of a hero's journey from nobody to defender of the realm, Mask of the Betrayer goes extra planar with, meaning that we explore some of the realms of D&D. Gods are involved, it's a whole thing. And honestly, it's really well written and it's very cool. It ties into the main campaign a little bit, and you do have to be careful about managing a spirit resource, because if you run out of it, you'll just straight up die, which is kind of what I was referring to earlier when I talked about the resting being a bit restricted, but even this is relatively forgiving. Now, Mask of the Betrayer's ending is probably the best part of it, because there are tons of variation to this. And again, kind of no matter how you get there, it feels like a proper ending to the game that should have been in the original main campaign. This just feels like the last act of the main campaign. And without spoiling it, there's not much more I could tell you, but it is remarkably well done. And while the main campaign can be hit or miss, I think if you take nothing else away from this review, I do think everybody who's remotely interested in these games should play through the main campaign and Mask of the Betrayer. They are very much so worth your time as a whole. That leaves us with 2 more campaigns to go. These are less compelling, quite frankly. Storms of Zehir has some cool ideas, and it feels largely like an experiment. For starters, you can make an entirely custom party, and then there are also some set characters you can meet along the way and take along with you if you want, but you can run around with a fully customized party. And more than that, the game sees you actively engaging with like a trading system. You can buy goods in one city, take them to another city, and sell them for profit. It also introduces a really cool world map, actually, which is probably a world map you'd be more familiar with in modern games. So not much to look at these days, but honestly at the time, very cool. In fact, a lot of modern CRPGs have just kind of co-opted this world map, really, or at least elements of it. But unfortunately, the story of Storms of Zehir kind of falls flat. It's okay at best. Again, the game is more about the new mechanical stuff than the story, which is lackluster. Storms of Zehir did actually add a lot of the cool character creation options, though, like the Yonti. Honestly, I'd still probably check it out if you have some spare time, but you're definitely not really missing anything by not doing it. But that brings us to the worst of the bunch, and that is Mysteries of Westgate. Mysteries of Westgate is foreshadowed in Storms of Zehir. It's not exactly a direct sequel by any means, but there is, again, a little bit of foreshadowing, though I wouldn't consider it like a sequel or anything. But the problem with Mysteries of Westgate is that the quality takes a bit of a nosedive, and this is because it was actually developed by a different studio, Ocean Studios, rather than Obsidian. A lot of the stuff is just noticeably worse. The pacing, the voice acting, the idea is pretty cool. You play a character who found a mask in a dungeon a while back, but it's been haunting your dreams, so you have to take it to Westgate to find a way to make it stop, and then you uncover a plot, and it gets bigger than you think. And again, the concept is pretty cool, and there are actually multiple paths through this one. There's kind of a good and evil way through it, but ultimately it's just fundamentally worse quality-wise than the rest of it. And that brings us to Steam Deck compatibility. It is very possible to play this on the Steam Deck, however, generally speaking, it's very difficult to do, at least for the average person, because what you're going to have to do is A, go get the game off of GOG, which is already more difficult than, say, using Steam, because it's the Steam Deck, of course, but you can go to desktop mode, get the Heroic Games Launcher, download GOG, and then download the game from there, add it to your Steam library, and go that way. However, just that also isn't enough. You have to download a compatibility version of Proton, as well as a couple of other things. I'll actually link in the description below a guide to getting it set up, but it took me about an hour or so, and that's just to get the game running properly. And then even once you get the game running properly, you're going to have to probably manually adjust the controls, as none of the layouts available really work, as they're all kind of default layouts. On top of this, things like the Steam Cloud saves, of course, don't work because it's not a Steam game, but doing all of that just to play a version that you can only play on the Steam Deck because of the cloud saves probably isn't going to do it for most people. So I would say for most, it's probably a no-go. That said, absolutely doable, and it does play pretty well once you get it to the point where you can play it. But that brings us to our positives, negatives, and then we're going to wrap this thing up. Now, when it comes to positives and negatives even, again, a lot of this kind of changes depending on which module or campaign you're talking about. But in general, I think positives are that there's a ton of content baseline. Like, even if you don't want to do the extra modules, don't want to check out the persistent world stuff, which again, a lot of people don't, there is still a ton of content in just the base game, if you will. You have 4 campaigns you could easily spend 100 plus hours with. They have some cool ideas. You can kind of see how these things went on to influence later games, and it's a good time. But that, combined with all of the modules you can download and then enjoy, you could easily get hundreds of hours worth of content that is genuinely pretty unique. Then we start looking at the fact that this is my favorite edition of D&D in a video game, 3.5, makes things like the character creation options and just the system and the combat a blast for me personally. And again, when it comes to character creation options, you can play just a ton of races and things that you just do not see in other D&D games, which is a huge plus. In terms of the negatives, you still can come across a few game-breaking bugs. There are ways around them and ways to fix them, provided you're willing to mess around in a file or two here and there. But while the GOG version is pretty stable, again, I only really encountered like 1 or 2 problems over the course of playing all of this, it's definitely still possible to run into game-breaking bugs, which can be a little frustrating given the age of the title, because if you're not willing to fix it yourself, it's just not going to get fixed. Another negative is really the lack of community support. As I mentioned at the beginning of the review, this game didn't really see the adoption that would have given it a lot more legs, if you will. While the main campaigns are much loved and there are a ton of really cool modules you can check out, at the end of the day, there's just less here overall than Neverwinter Nights, especially since the Enhanced Edition for the original game came out and restored a lot of the functionality to the base game over there, so you can actually go over there right now and have a great time, whereas you have to jump through a lot of hoops to do the same thing on Neverwinter Nights 2. Which brings us to our last negative, and that's just, it's a lot of unrealized potential. As I mentioned, the main campaign especially has a lot of mechanics that just kind of fail to land. And ultimately, the system that they built, especially with all the character creation options, just has so much promise that just kind of never got really fleshed out on an official level. Again, modules will do some of this stuff for you. So, you know, I kind of get it. But nonetheless, it's a shame this game never got to be more than it is, frankly. That, of course, brings us to our conclusion. You can buy this on GOG right now for $20. $10 and potentially get hundreds of hours worth of content for it. And I think it's safe to say nobody's been waiting for the last 16 years to hear me tell them it's a good game, but it is a good game. And if nothing else, I would recommend you check out, again, the main campaign and Mask of the Betrayer. They are genuinely, together, very, very good. And I think everybody who enjoys these types of games should probably play those two, because it's definitely a cool piece of gaming history. And honestly, I'm a little sad it never got the chance to spread its wings and be, again, more than what it is. But what it is still a very cool experience. So that's all I've got for you guys. I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.